The hostess looked at my invitation, then looked at me, then looked at the screen again. Her face went completely white. Not pink, not flushed, white. Like she'd seen something she wasn't prepared for. She turned slowly toward the event coordinator standing behind her and whispered something I couldn't fully hear. The only word I caught was, her. Then every head in that lobby turned toward me. Not toward my father, who was standing 3 feet away smugly straightening his cufflinks. Not toward my stepmother, who had spent the last 6 months making sure I wasn't included in a single wedding planning conversation. Toward me. And my father, who 30 seconds earlier had leaned close to my ear and whispered, "You weren't invited." With that particular smile he reserved for moments he thought he'd won. That smile disappeared so fast, it was like someone had wiped it off his face with a cloth. My name is Rachel Delaney, I'm 34 years old. And what happened that Saturday afternoon in the lobby of the Hartwell Grand Hotel in Charleston changed my family forever. But to understand what the hostess saw on that screen, you have to understand what my father spent 20 years making sure I didn't know. I grew up believing I was the difficult one. That was the story. Every family has a story they tell about their children, and in ours, my younger brother Colton was the golden boy, and I was the complicated one. The one who asked too many questions. The one who made everything emotional. My father, Dennis Delaney, was a civil engineer who built his reputation on precision and control. And somewhere along the way, he decided that daughters who had opinions were structural problems, to be managed rather than people to be known. I don't say that bitterly. I say it factually because it took me 30 years to understand the difference. My mother, Diane, died when I was 11. Car accident on Route 9 in November, black ice, gone before the ambulance arrived. I know people say things like, "She was the glue." And it sounds like a cliché, but in our case it was engineering. She was literally the reason that household functioned with anything resembling warmth. After she died, my father didn't fall apart. He reorganized, he made schedules. He hired a housekeeper named Pam, who was efficient and cold, and fed us dinner at 6 o'clock every night like we were employees on a lunch break. I was 11, Colton was 8. And neither of us ever really talked about Mom again, because Dad made it clear through 100 small silences that grief was not on the agenda. 4 years later, he married Sandra. Sandra was not a villain in the movie of The Weak Sense. She didn't lock me in closets or steal my lunch money. What she did was quieter and somehow worse. She made it clear, through every small daily gesture, that her interest in our family began and ended with my father and Colton. She attended every single one of Colton's baseball games. She learned my father's coffee order within the first week. When I came home with a second-place ribbon from the regional debate competition, she looked up from her magazine and said, "That's fun, sweetie," before going back to reading. When I showed my father, he nodded and said he was proud, but he was already turning to ask Colton about practice. The ribbon ended up in a drawer somewhere. I never found it after we moved. By the time I left for college at 18, I had learned to operate without needing anything from that house. I got a partial scholarship, worked waitressing jobs, and finished my communications degree in 4 years without a single tuition payment from my father. Colton, I later learned, had his entire education funded without question. I'm not saying I expected charity. I'm saying the difference was never acknowledged, never explained, never discussed. It simply was. I built a life, a real one, in Atlanta. I worked my way up at a mid-size marketing agency, eventually becoming a creative director. I got an apartment I was genuinely proud of. I had friends who knew my whole story and loved me anyway. I dated, stumbled, learned. By my early 30s, I had reached the point where the wound my family had left behind wasn't bleeding anymore. It had become scar tissue. Functional. Part of the landscape. Then Colton called to tell me he was getting married. His name was Colton and hers was Breezy, which I promise is her real name, and they had met at a CrossFit gym 3 years earlier and gotten engaged on a beach in Tulum. He sounded genuinely happy. I told him I was glad, and I meant it. Whatever had happened between us growing up, Colton had never been openly cruel to me. He was passive in the way youngest children sometimes are. Complicit without being calculating. He took the advantages offered to him without examining where they came from. You can be angry at someone for that without hating them. I assumed I would be invited to the wedding. We weren't close, but we were siblings. I assumed wrong. 3 weeks after the engagement call, I received a group family newsletter. Sandra's idea. She sent them quarterly with updates about Colton's life and occasional mentions of my father's work projects. And buried in the third paragraph was a note that the wedding would be a small, intimate ceremony. Immediate family and closest friends only, with a reception to follow. I thought nothing of it. I assumed I was immediate family. Then I didn't receive a save, the date. I waited. Then I called Colton. He was weird on the phone in a way I recognized from childhood. That particular quality of someone who has information they've been instructed not to share. He said the invitations were still being finalized. He'd call me soon. He didn't call. 6 weeks before the wedding date, I still had nothing. So I called my father. And that conversation is one I will not forget as long as I live. He picked up on the second ring, which was unusual. He sounded prepared. He told me, in the tone he used for explaining why a budget proposal had been rejected, that Breezy had specific ideas about the guest list and that with everything that had happened, it might be better if I wasn't at the ceremony itself. He said it so calmly, like he was reading from a prepared statement. I asked him what he meant by everything that had happened. He said I knew what he meant. I asked again. He said that things I had said at his birthday dinner 2 years earlier had upset Sandra significantly, and that Breezy felt the tension would affect the day. I want to tell you what I said at that birthday dinner, because it matters. I said. In response to Sandra's comment that Colton had basically raised himself into the man he is today. That actually Colton had significant financial and emotional support from the family, and that not everyone in the family had experienced the same. That's it. I said it calmly. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I made an accurate factual observation in a room where accurate factual observations were apparently classified information. Sandra had gone quiet. My father had changed the subject. And apparently, that one moment had followed me for 2 years, and was now the stated reason I wasn't invited to my brother's wedding. I stayed on the phone with my father for another 4 minutes. He said he hoped I understood. I said I did not understand, but that I would not make it difficult. I hung up. Then I sat in my car in the parking garage of my office building for 40 minutes doing nothing, not crying, just sitting. Feeling the particular weight of a wound that had reopened so cleanly it almost didn't hurt at first. Almost. Here's what I didn't tell my father on that call. Here's what I had found out 3 months earlier, completely by accident, from a woman named Lorraine Whitfield. Lorraine was 71, recently retired, and she had been my mother's closest friend from childhood. Through the day my mother died, I had met her at a memorial garden event for a local hospice organization my mother had volunteered with years ago. I hadn't seen Lorraine in probably 15 years. She recognized me immediately. We had coffee. She cried twice, and at the end of 2 hours, just as we were gathering our coats to leave, she said something that recalibrated everything I thought I knew about my own life. She said my mother had left me something. Not just left it in a will. She had specifically and deliberately structured it through a trust that would not activate until I turned 35 or until a triggering event occurred. She said she had assumed I already knew. When she saw my face, she understood immediately that I did not. She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. Her expression shifted from warm to careful. Then she told me that my mother, who had come from a wealthier family than she ever let on during her marriage, had created this trust quietly. Specifically because she had told Lorraine once that she worried about what would happen to Rachel if something happened to her. Not Colton, Rachel specifically, because she knew. She knew exactly what my father was. Not evil, just selective. She had known what I would need protection from before I was old enough to understand the concept. The trust was managed by a quiet firm in Charleston. The amount in it was not small. I will not say the exact number, because it is not the point, but I will tell you it was life-changing. And it had been sitting there, managed carefully for 23 years, waiting for me. My father had known about it since my mother's death. He had never mentioned it. Not once. Not a single time in my entire adult life, when I was working double shifts and applying for student loans and buying furniture from thrift stores, had he ever said one word about the fact that my mother had left me something significant. I spent the following 3 months working with an attorney. Everything Lorraine told me was accurate. The trust was real, it was healthy, it was mine. And my father had been listed as a co-trustee until I turned 18, at which point oversight transferred to the firm. He had not stolen anything. What he had done was simpler and in some ways worse. He had simply never told me. He had allowed me to believe for my entire adult life that I had nothing, while something significant existed in my name. Whether he had convinced himself it wasn't his responsibility to tell me, or whether he had simply preferred a version of reality where I remained dependent on nothing and therefore owed nothing. I genuinely don't know. But I know he knew. So when he told me calmly that I wasn't invited to my brother's wedding, I was already holding this information. I had been holding it for 3 months. And I had made a decision. I was going to Charleston anyway. Not to cause a scene. Not to blow up the wedding. I want to be clear about that, because I know how these stories can sound. I wasn't going for revenge in the dramatic sense. I was going because Colton was my brother, because my mother would have been at that wedding. Because I had decided that being excluded from my own family's milestones by people who had benefited from my silence for 30 years was something I was no longer willing to accept quietly. I booked a hotel room 2 blocks from the Hartwell Grand. I bought a dress. I drove to Charleston the morning of the wedding. I did not call ahead. I did not warn anyone. I simply went. What I had not told my father, had not told my attorney, had not told anyone except my closest friend Marisol, was that the triggering event in my mother's trust had occurred. One of the conditions she had written in was this: if Rachel is excluded from a significant family event by the co-trustee or his household, the trust activates immediately rather than waiting for the birthday threshold. My mother had written that clause. She had anticipated this. 23 years ago, she had sat with an attorney and anticipated the exact shape of the wound her daughter might one day carry. The trust firm had contacted me when I informed them of my exclusion from the wedding. It was now active. And the firm had sent a representative to the Hartwell Grand that day, not to interfere with the wedding, but to deliver paperwork that required my signature to finalize the transfer. They had also, apparently, notified the event coordinator at the hotel as part of a legal witnessing process that someone from our family, specifically me, would be arriving. Which is why when the hostess scanned my invitation, the one I had printed from an email that had arrived from the trust firm, not a wedding invitation but a legal access request that the firm had coordinated with the hotel. She saw something on that screen that made her face go white. She saw a legal flag. She saw that the event coordinator had been notified. She saw a name that was attached to a process she had been briefed on that morning. And she understood immediately that whoever was standing in front of her was not a crasher. She turned and said, "Sir, she's here." And the event coordinator appeared from a side hallway in under 30 seconds. My father was standing 2 feet away from me. His smirk was completely gone. He looked like a man who had just watched a building he designed collapse in real time. Sandra was gripping her small beaded clutch with both hands. Neither of them said a word. The coordinator introduced herself as Melissa and shook my hand and asked me to follow her. I did. The trust firm representative, a composed woman in her 50s named Patricia, was already seated in a private meeting room adjacent to the main lobby. She stood when I entered. She had a leather portfolio open on the table. She explained briefly that this would take about 20 minutes and that I was free to attend any portion of the event I chose afterward. My father had followed us into the hallway. Melissa gently but clearly told him this meeting was private. He stood in the hallway. I watched his face through the small rectangular window in the door as Melissa pulled it shut. He looked old in a way I hadn't noticed before. Not physically. He was still upright, still dressed carefully, still the man who organized everything. But something in his expression had collapsed. I signed the paperwork. Patricia explained the timeline for the transfer. I thanked her. She left through a side exit. I sat alone in that meeting room for about 4 minutes. Then I made a decision I had not planned to make when I walked into that hotel. I went to the wedding. Not to the ceremony. That had already begun. But to the reception, which was in the grand ballroom 1 floor up, and which was just beginning when I walked in. Colton saw me almost immediately. He froze. Then he crossed the room, and I want to say this clearly, he did not look angry. He looked ashamed. Which is different. He said my name once, quietly, like a question. I said, "I'm not here to ruin anything." He nodded. Then after a moment he said, "I should have called you back." I said, "Yes. You should have." We stood there for a few seconds, in the particular silence of two people who have too much history to process in a single moment. Then Breezy appeared beside him, lovely in her dress, looking uncertain. I introduced myself. I said I was glad they had found each other. I meant it. My father found me about 20 minutes later, near the windows overlooking the garden. Sandra was not with him. He stood beside me and looked out at the lawn for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "I should have told you. Not I'm sorry. Not I was wrong." But it was more than I had ever heard from him before, and I have learned that you take what people are capable of giving. I told him I knew about the trust for 3 months before the wedding. I told him I had given him opportunity after opportunity over the years to treat me like his daughter, and that I had not received them. I told him I was not interested in punishing him. I was interested in living honestly from this point forward. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your mother knew you better than I did." I said, "Yes, she did. I stayed for dinner. I danced once alone to a song that came on that my mother used to hum in the kitchen when she thought no one was listening." Colton caught my eye from across the room during that song. He raised his glass slightly. I raised mine back. It wasn't forgiveness fully formed. It was the beginning of the conversation that forgiveness requires. That's all it was. But it was real. On the drive back to my hotel that night, I pulled over once on a quiet street under an oak tree, and let myself cry, not from sadness entirely, but from the particular relief of no longer carrying something alone. My mother had known. She had seen it coming, and she had built me a door out of the room, before I even understood I was locked in. She had loved me with enough clarity and foresight to protect me from 30 feet underground and 3 years of distance. I keep her letter in my car. Not a dramatic letter, not a long one. It came with the trust paperwork. The firm had held it all these years. It was 3 paragraphs in her handwriting, which I barely remembered, but recognized immediately the way you recognize something that has always been inside you. She said she hoped I never needed it. She said if I was reading it, she was sorry she wasn't there. She said she wanted me to know that she had seen me clearly from the very beginning, and that being seen clearly is the greatest gift one person can give another, and she wanted to make sure I had at least one person in my life who had done that for me, even if she couldn't be there to do it in person. If you have ever been the overlooked one, the one who was told without words that you mattered less, the one who built everything alone while watching others receive what was simply handed to them, I want you to know something. The person who overlooks you does not get to determine your value. They only get to determine their own loss. And sometimes the people who love us most do their most important work quietly, in ways we don't discover until we're ready to receive them. I am 34 years old. I have a life I built from nothing, and a foundation my mother built from love. I am my father's daughter in some ways I'm still learning to accept. I am my mother's daughter in every way that has ever mattered. And I walked into that hotel lobby without an invitation and walked out with everything she always intended me to have. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you've ever been the one who wasn't invited, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Because sometimes the people who exclude us are doing us the greatest favor of our lives. They just don't know it yet.